Just a couple of things as we jump off, and thanks for joining the call. This is a follow-up meeting to our meeting on June 14th that outlined the program year 2017 funding notice. We got feedback that there was interest in walking through the budget worksheet, which that is the focus of this session. I want to say just one thing before we get going here, kind of an update regarding the program year 17 funds. I know that we talked about early submissions on that June 14th webinar and asked, and we actually received, I think, a couple responses by the June 20th deadline. Actually, one completed signed application. Unfortunately, the department is still waiting for the program year 17 federal terms and conditions from the Department of Labor. So as we discussed last week, this is something that we absolutely need to move forward. It's a requirement to be included in the grant award. So based on this late date, it's highly unlikely that we're going to be able to establish the PY'17 grant before July 1. So I just wanted to throw that out there and let you know exactly where we're at today. We are going to be working with our accounting staff to expedite the rollover process as soon as we have a budget or budget authority so that the grants can be executed as soon as possible. So just wanted to give that information before we get into the technical side of things. So with that, I'll throw it over to Chuck and Laura Dom to walk through the budget worksheet.
Thanks, John. We're going to do a brief walkthrough of the uniform budget template, and hopefully everybody can see my screen. I'm going to navigate first to the section D. Section D, which is on the screen in front of you hopefully, is where you enter your total estimated project costs, which you do not have to calculate. This was provided to you in the funding notice last week. So you can see in this worksheet, I've entered dummy numbers. So my total PY'17 allocation is $5 million, which is split evenly between adult, dislocated worker, and youth. And then the admin allocation is 10%, or $500,000. Now, this worksheet, this workbook, is going to be used to budget for PY'17 formula costs only. It does not include carry-in from PY'16, it does not include other funding sources, and it does not include other grants such as your trade case management grants. So you have to keep that in mind. In the first quarter column on the left, you want to enter your first quarter costs. That must not exceed the first quarter limitation as specified in the funding notice last week. In the fourth quarter column, you want to enter your total costs for each funding stream and for admin. And then the total at the bottom should equal your total PY'17 formula allocation. One thing I want to point out is that you may see an error message in one of the fields, like in this field right here. If you want to troubleshoot any error messages, click on the field with the error message, and then you look at the formula and the formula bar up at the top. And the formula will indicate it will reference the cell in which the error originated. And in addition, it will show the calculation that was performed that resulted in the error. In this case, This error resulted because the amount I entered for admin was not rounded down, so I could correct that right now. And the error message disappears. Another thing I want to point out is when you troubleshoot errors and you click on the error field, one of the things that may help is if you click on the Formulas tab up on the menu bar, and then you click on Evaluate Formula. And then you click on a pop-up box will show up, and then you click on Evaluate, and it will interpret the underlined section in the formula. And this may or may not help you, but if you're troubleshooting the error messages, this is the tool you can use to correct any errors that you have in the spreadsheet. Another thing I want to point out is that if you don't budget 20% of your combined youth in school and youth out of school allocation for work-based training, you're going to see an error message. So in this, for example, let me change this field to $200,000. So if I change it to $200,000, it's going to be less than the full 20%, so you're going to see an error message pop up. If I change that back to $300,000, the error message disappears. And like I said before, the amounts that are in the fourth quarter column must equal the total amount of the grant, your PY'17 allocation, in total and also by funding stream. These amounts in the fourth quarter column are what will appear in your grant budget and the grant agreement, and they will also be what you see in GRS for each line item. One thing I want to point out is that this year we've added a few new line items. For example, we split out fringe benefits from salaries, so now you have a separate line item for personnel and a separate line item for fringe benefits. Another thing we've also had to do because of the GATA requirements is we've had to split out the indirect costs from the direct costs. So in previous years, you did not have a separate line item for indirect costs. All indirect costs were included or buried in the other line items such as admin and other program. This year we had to add line items for admin indirect, youth in school indirect, youth out of school indirect, adult indirect, and dislocated worker indirect. The next section that we're going to talk about in the uniform budget template is section C. So let's navigate to section C. Section C has multiple tabs for all the different line items. Section C is where you enter the budget detail and the narrative for each line item. So each tab in section C has a number that corresponds to the budget line item in section A. So let me navigate to the beginning of section C. So 1A, for example, is the budget line item for admin, salaries, and wages. So you'd enter the detail in this section, each salary, position, the basis. The basis could be year, month, or hour. Since this is a 2-year grant, in a lot of cases you're probably going to use year as the basis and then enter 2 for 2 years. There's also a section where you can enter non-state totals for match or leverage resources. And then at the bottom, there's an admin or narrative box where you can enter a brief narrative that you should use to justify the costs for that line item. Like I mentioned before, each section in Section C, it has a number that corresponds to the line item in the budget. If you see any tabs that do not have a number and that are grayed out, that means you do not have to complete it. For example, let's go to contractual services. Contractual services is where you would normally enter your subcontracts and your subawards. And I had a couple of questions from grantees about, whether or not they have to itemize each subaward in this section. Well, the answer is you don't even have to complete the section. It's grayed out. There is no corresponding line item number in the grant budget, so you can disregard any sections or line items that are grayed out. I want to go to the indirect, which is 17A. So line 17 would be for your indirect, and there are separate line items for indirect admin and indirect youth in school, indirect youth out of school, indirect adult, and indirect dislocated worker. So 17A is indirect admin. You can choose to charge all of your indirect to admin, or you can allocate your indirect between admin and the funding streams and program. A lot of you I know charge all of your admin to indirect, and that's fine. If that's the case, then you'll only complete 17A for admin indirect, and you'll disregard 17B, 17C, 17D, and 17E. For admin indirect, you just follow the instructions up at the top. You have to enter your direct cost base. In this case, we're saying it's $2 million. We're using the de minimis rate in this example, so you enter the de minimis rate of 10%, which gives you a cost of $200,000 for admin indirect. This is the amount that will appear in the budget, and it will be the amount that you have for indirect in your grant agreement and in GRS, so you want to make sure that this amount is correct. Ideally, your base times your negotiated rate or the de minimis rate should result in the amount of indirect that you want to include in your grant agreement, although that may not always be the case. For example, you may cap your indirect cost rate reimbursement to $100,000. For example, you may not want to exceed your admin cap of 10%, so you limit your indirect cost rate recovery to $200,000. If that's the case, then you should enter $100,000 on this tab, and this is what's going to appear on the budget in Section A for indirect. And then in this section here, there's only one line, but that's where you would enter any indirect that's going to be paid out of non-state funding resources, that's going to be matched. You don't have to complete that though. Match is not a requirement for WIOA. The amounts that you enter here should show up on Section B, which does not have to be completed. Section B is a section in the Uniform Budget Template for non-state resources for match and leverage resources. So this amount, this total, is going to flow through to Section A, the budget. So you want to make sure you complete the Section C first, because all the information here is going to flow over to Section A. And you want to provide enough detail to justify the amount of costs that you're claiming or that you're budgeting for that line item. And, there's a degree of subjectivity to that. If you look at the instructions, the general instructions for Section C, it says that the degree of specificity in section C should depend on the nature of the grant. And so you'd expect to see a lot more detail and specificity with a small grant where you have $500, for example, for travel, as opposed to a much larger grant like your formula grants where you may budget $500,000 for other program costs, and that includes miscellaneous costs like subawards, travel, equipment, and so on. So I don't want to go into too much detail about what you need to include in your description and the narrative at the bottom, but it should be enough to justify the cost. And for the section C tabs that address salaries and fringe benefits, you'd probably want to go into a lot more detail and provide a list of employees and their salaries. So that's the main section that you have to complete, section C. After you complete section C, the budget detail and narrative, it's all downhill from there. We're going to section A. Section A is the budget template. This is what's going to appear in your grant agreement and in GRS. And so we already completed all of the section C, all of the required section C worksheets, and the amounts that were, the totals from those worksheets flow to section A. One thing you have to do for most of these amounts, you won't have to complete. Like I said, they flow from section C. You do, however, have to complete this blue field up at the top, which is total revenue. That's going to equal your total grant amount, your total PY'17 allocation, which in our case, in this example, is $5 million. So this is a manual entry in this field up here for total revenue. You enter your total PY'17 formula allocation of $5 million. These amounts for each of the line items, 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, those flow from the correspondingly numbered tabs in section C. So you don't have to complete those. And then the total amount for all those tabs is going to appear at the bottom, $5 million. And that amount should equal the amount that you entered for revenue in the revenue field up at the top of section A, the budget. And then you should also do a check for accuracy to ensure that all these totals for each of the line items equal the amounts that you entered on section D. We'll go back to section D. For the WIOA program funding, that's good. All those amounts on section A should equal these amounts under the fourth quarter in section D. And these are going to be all of the line items and the line item amounts that will appear in the grant agreement and in GRS. So that's section A. There are also a few fields up at the top that you have to complete. For example, your organization name, the CSFA number. At the last call, somebody had a question about the CSFA number. The CSFA number appears on the uniform grant application, which was one of the attachments to the funding notice sent out last week. So you can refer to the uniform grant application for the CSFA number and the CSFA description. You also need to enter your DUNS number. For NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, these are not competitive grants, so there was no funding opportunity number for the WIOA formula grant, so you can leave that blank. If this was a competitive grant, you could refer to the funding opportunity notice and enter that number here. Fiscal year would be state fiscal year 18. So you have to complete the information at the top of section A, the budget, and this field here, and then you have to make sure that the total amount for the revenue equals the total amount on line 18, and you have to make sure that all the line items equal the line items in section D and are equal to what you want to charge to the grant for those line items. Like I said, there are a few new line items for PY'17. We've added line items for fringe benefits and also indirect. So all these line items above line 17 are for direct costs only. So you may have a director and you charge 50% of his time directly, and the other 50% is recovered through the indirect cost rate. So the 50% of his time would probably be up under 1A, and then the other 50% would be recovered as an indirect cost on line 17, the $200,000. The next worksheet we're going to look at is Section A, Indirect Worksheet. Section A, Indirect Worksheet, for the most part, is a standalone worksheet. You have to complete all the fields manually. The one exception would be the fields for indirect. So, and you can tell that those fields are locked down, so you can't enter anything into that field anyway. But the amount for the indirect line items comes from Section A, the grant budget, from 17A, 17B, 17C, 17D. So we're charging, in this example, we're charging all of our indirect to admin. So the only indirect that we're going to see would be the $200,000 for admin indirect on line 17A. There is no indirect for 17B, youth in school, 17C, youth out of school, or any other funding stream. Everything's charged to admin in our example. The numbers that you have to enter, first of all, you have to enter, well, let me backtrack a little bit. The whole purpose of this worksheet is to provide detail for line items that have been omitted from the WIOA budget template. So if you recall, we had some grayed out line items and tabs for travel, supplies, consultants, occupancy, also subcontracts and subawards. So you don't have to enter that detail. It's not being captured in the other worksheets, but you do have to break it out here. The roll-up line items have to be broken down by the sub-roll-up lines, travel, equipment, and the roll-up line items would be your other admin and other program costs. So you have to break out the detail by travel, equipment, supplies, occupancy, contractual and subawards, and miscellaneous. Otherwise, all the line items, all the entries under column F are going to be exactly what you have for the corresponding line item in section A. So you just copy these amounts from section A and you insert them into column F of section A indirect worksheet. Those are your total costs. At the top, you'll enter your indirect cost rate. In this case, we're using the de minimis rate, so we enter the 10% de minimis rate up at the top. In column G, we enter any direct cost-based exclusions. So for the de minimis rate, you're required to use modified total direct costs, which is defined in the uniform guidance. And the exclusions for modified total direct costs would include rent expense, so we'll look at adult. So in column G, we'll enter any exclusions from the direct cost base to calculate MTDC, modified total direct costs. So your exclusions from modified total direct costs would include the portion of each subaward or subcontract. So that applies both to subcontractors and subrecipients, the portion of each subaward that exceeds $25,000. And so you get $25,000 for each award that you're allowed to include in your MTDC, and that's a one-time thing. So if you have a subaward that spans multiple years, you can only include $25,000 for the first year in MTDC. So you want to exclude all subcontracts and subawards exceeding $25,000. So we've entered that amount here in column G for adult, contractual, and subawards. You want to deduct all of your rent expense from MTDC. So we've done that here. We've subtracted the $10,000 for occupancy expenses. And that can include utilities. So you may not exclude all of that amount, but you definitely want to exclude rent. Other exclusions for MTDC are tuition. If you look at the definition in the uniform guidance, it says that tuition and participant support costs have to be excluded from MTDC. So we've deducted $500,000 for occupational training ITAs. According to DOL, ITAs would be an exclusion from MTDC. We've also excluded all supported services from MTDC, the $100,000 budgeted for adult supported services. An exception to the training exclusion for MTDC would be work-based learning. So we're paying on-the-job training and incumbent worker training, and that entails a lot of effort on our part. We have to monitor that, and we have to cut a check to the employer, or we have to cut a paycheck. We may have to cut a paycheck to the OJT participant. Well, no, we wouldn't cut a paycheck for the OJT participant. But those are included at MTDC. Your on-the-job training, incumbent worker training, and work experience are included. So we did not deduct that in column G. And then the MTDC, your direct cost base, and it may not always be MTDC. If you have a negotiated rate, your direct cost base would be whatever would be defined in the negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, and that could be direct salaries and wages. So if the only thing in your direct cost base would be direct salaries and wages, you would enter all costs under column G under the exclusions except for direct salaries and wages. But in this case, we're using the de minimis rate. So we're required to use MTDC. In column H, after you enter all the numbers in columns F and column G, column H will automatically calculate the direct cost base for each line item. And then after that, this worksheet will take the 10% indirect cost rate and multiply it by the total of the direct cost base for all line items, and that will, and the total will display under total indirect costs at the bottom of the worksheet. So this will be our total indirect costs calculated on this indirect worksheet. And then this $200,000 here is from Section A for the total of all the indirect costs on the budget, Section A budget. And then the worksheet compares the calculated indirect costs on the indirect worksheet, and it subtracts the amount from the budget, and then it gives you the total in this field here, and the total should be 0. If you calculated your indirect costs and you plan to charge all of your indirect costs to the grant, the total should be 0. There may be cases, and there are probably a lot of instances where this may apply to local areas where you don't plan to charge all of the indirect to the grant. You decided you're only going to charge $200,000. If you charge more than that, you're going to exceed the 10% admin cap. So if that's the case, and we'll change some of our numbers here. Let me see. Let's take this out of MTDC exclusions. Just for the sake of example, we'll delete this amount. So this increases our direct cost base by $900,000. So our total direct costs calculated on the spreadsheet should increase by $90,000. So the new total, the new calculation is $290,000, and the amount that we're budgeting on the budget is $200,000. So that leaves a difference of $90,000. So what you could do is, you can enter a note at the bottom in the comments field saying that we're only budgeting $200,000. Our total allowable indirect costs, based on our estimates of our costs and our direct cost exclusions, are $290,000, but we're actually only allocating $200,000. The other thing you could do is you don't want to change any of the numbers in columns F or G, because those are your actual numbers, and those are what we're going to use to review, or what DCEO accounting is going to use to review and approve the worksheet and the budget. But it's also for your benefit so that you can see, especially if you're using the de minimis rate, you can see what your total allowable indirect cost rate recovery is, and if your indirect costs are going to come in below or above that amount. In our case, our total allowable indirect costs using the de minimis rate would be $290,000, but we're only going to budget $200,000. So what you could do, the only place you want to enter a plug number is in the indirect cost rate at the top. So you could lower your indirect cost rate. It only goes out to 2 decimal places, so you're not going to be, if there's going to be a difference, you're not going to be able to eliminate the difference entirely. But let's change this to 9.86%. And then if we change that to 9.86%, no, it's not even close. Let's change it to 8.5%. No, we'll change it to 7.5%. So you just play around with the indirect cost rate at the top until you get the difference at the bottom to equal 0. Let's try this. Take one more stab at this. We'll change it to 7%. So now we've got it down to $3,000. So you want to get it as close to 0 as possible. And then in our comments field at the bottom, we'll mention that our actual indirect cost rate election is the de minimis rate of 10%. That's what we elected in the CAR system. That's what's going to appear in the grant agreement for the indirect cost rate percentage. But the actual amount in our budget is going to be $200,000, so that works out to an indirect cost rate of just under 7%. And there's probably a lot of confusion about this, but to summarize, most of these, you're going to enter your total costs in column F. And the total cost should equal the amount of the corresponding line item in section A. For the roll-up line items, you're going to enter your costs at the sub-roll-up line item level. So that's going to be travel, supplies, contractual and subawards, and miscellaneous. You enter the costs at the sub-roll-up line item level, and then there's a formula for the roll-up line items, which adds the costs for the sub-roll-up line item and gives you the total. So you enter your actual budgeted costs in column F. You enter your cost-based exclusions in column G. Column H is going to calculate automatically, and then the total of indirect costs will be calculated using the indirect cost rate and the direct cost base in column H, and that will appear in this field here at the bottom, total indirect costs. And then the fields immediately below that, those will flow over from the line 17 line items in section A in the budget, And then the very bottom field, the calculation will compare the sum of the total indirect costs calculated on this worksheet minus the line items for the indirect costs. And that ideally should equal 0. If it doesn't equal 0, you should note the reason why in the comments field at the bottom, or you should adjust the indirect cost rate at the top to make it equal 0, and then, just add a comment at the bottom indicating that you're charging less than your full allowable indirect cost rate. And the instructions, the general instructions, will address Section A, Section C, and Section B. The program-specific instructions will address Section D, which is the WIOA funding template, and the Section A indirect cost worksheet. So if you have any questions, you can give me a call or you can refer to the instructions. And like Chelsea mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this workbook is available for download in the bottom of the download pod in the conference screen. So you can download this. This is the same workbook that is available on WorkNet under the e-policy portal. This just has example numbers to refer to for an example. So that's pretty much all I've got to say about for the walkthrough of the budget template. Are there any questions? Let me go to the chat pod. I haven't been able to see the chat pod. Okay, there's a question. The spreadsheets indicate that we can change formulas as needed if extra lines are added. However, and I believe this is in reference to Section C, where you have all the tabs for the budget detail and narrative. You can add additional lines if needed, but it doesn't allow you to copy down the formula in column H, and it doesn't even allow you to enter your own formula or make your own entry. And so, Laura, could you address that? Because I think we've been having the grantees send us their spreadsheets, and we forward them to accounting to unlock. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
I commented in the chat for people to send their spreadsheets to me if they need that done.
Okay. So we sent out there was a new attachment F that was sent out last week. I think it went out last week Friday. It's in the e-policy portal available for download. So that unlocked the worksheets for the FATA and for the Section A ICI for your indirect cost rate election, which I should mention, by the way, should correspond to the indirect cost rate election that you made in CARS. So if you do need to add additional lines, for example, for Section 1A or for salaries, you could send your workbook to Laura, and she could forward it to DCO accounting to have it unlocked, so you could add the additional lines. There was another question. If we put in 2 years, it doubles all of our salaries, so we would not have enough admin money to cover the cost of admin salaries. If we can't put carryover in, what do we do? Like I mentioned previously, you want to make sure that the amounts that are in Section A and in Section D are what will appear in your grant agreement and in GRS. So if, you could use different bases for the Section C detail. You could use hours, you could use months, you could use year. So you should use the basis that will give you the correct amount that you want to charge to the grant. So if 2 years is too much, then you could use 1 year, or you could use 15 months, or you can use 16 months. Use whatever basis that will give you the correct amount for that employee. Another question is, what does MTCD stand for? MTDC is modified total direct cost. It's MTDC, and it's defined in the uniform guidance. We also addressed it in the GATA frequently asked questions, which appear on the GATA section of Illinois WorkNet. So you can refer to the GATA frequently asked questions, and it goes into more detail about MTDC. MTDC is used for the de minimis rate. It can also be used for a negotiated indirect rate. You could choose to use MTDC for your federally negotiated rate. For state negotiated rate, I think they're limiting you to direct salaries and wages. But MTDC is what you would use for the de minimis rate, and that basically includes all costs with the following exceptions. That would exclude the portion of each subcontract or subaward exceeding $25,000. That would exclude participant supportive services. It would exclude student tuition, which includes ITA costs. It would include rental costs for occupancy, and it would exclude individual items of equipment with a unit cost of $5,000 or more. So those are the MTDC exclusions if you're using modified total direct costs. And if you have any questions about that, you can refer to the uniform guidance at 2 CFR 200, or you could refer to the GATA frequently asked questions. I think there are a couple of questions in the frequently asked questions about MTDC. And there's one that includes the DOL response where they said that training costs to be excluded from MTDC would include ITAs, but it would not include work-based learning costs. And then another thing I want to mention, that indirect cost worksheet, that has to be completed for everyone, even if you're not claiming indirect costs. And I believe there are some counties that will not be charging indirect costs to these grants. And I know there's at least one local area that got a single function entity exemption. So if you have the single function exemption and you're charging everything direct, or if the county's not charging any indirect, then you would have no indirect costs, so you would have no line items for indirect. All those costs would be included in the direct cost line items, and then you would still have to complete the indirect worksheet, but you would just enter a 0 for the indirect cost rate at the top, and then enter something in the comments field at the bottom. But you still have to complete all column F, showing the amount of all the direct line items, including the breakdown of the roll-up line items by the sub-roll-up line items. And I think those are, and then I mentioned that the CSFA number is in the uniform grant budget. The uniform grant application which was one of the attachments to the funding notice. So you can refer back to the grant application for the CSFA number. I think that does it for all the questions. Laura, did you want to add anything?
No, not on the budget sheet.
Okay. Well, yeah, Laura, if you have something to add about anything else regarding the the PY'17 grant establishment. I guess we could address it now.
No, I just wanted to mention that the disclosures need to be completed and submitted. It needs to be the individual that's authorized to sign for the grant. Just like the grant agreement, if it has the wrong name in there, you could strike through it and handwrite in the right person's name and sign it, and with their title. Exhibit G needs to be submitted. This is the last year for Exhibit G. It is for only grants that are outside of DCEO, state grants that are outside of DCEO. So that's what needs to be put in there. So that should be fairly simple. And then there's been very few people that have completed the programmatic risk assessment, and that was included in the notice. That's the SurveyMonkey link that's included in there. So an individual or, so local areas would go and complete that risk assessment, that would be great. So we can go ahead and get those done and graded before the rollover is completed so that we can move with the grant once we're ready to.
Okay. Thanks, Laura. John, did you have anything that you want to add?
No, just to reiterate, the programmatic risk assessment looks like we have less than half of areas, so you can just get those things done, and like I said, we'll get these moving as soon as possible.
Okay. So if this is the last call for questions. If you want to add a question, if you want to ask a question, you can unmute your phone and ask us over the telephone line, or you could type up a question in the chat pod. A lot of the questions looks like they were already answered in the chat pod, and some of them are the same. So I think we addressed all of those. I'll give a few more seconds. Oh, there is a question. Follow-up question on Section A, indirect worksheet. You said that if we do not claim indirect costs, we put 0 on cell 12, but we'll enter the costs on column F. Does this mean that any entry on Section A will be entered on column F? Yeah, you should still enter in column F, which are your total direct costs. You should still enter those costs, manually enter those costs in column F. The only costs that are going to flow over from Section A, the budget, will be your indirect line items. And the purpose, even if you're not claiming indirect, the purpose of entering those costs under column F is so that you can provide a breakdown of the roll-up line items, your other admin costs, other program costs, occupational training costs, work-based learning costs. So that's where you will provide the detail on those amounts. The Section A indirect worksheet, that's a supporting worksheet, similar to the master budget that we used in previous years. The information on there is not included in the grant agreement or in GRS. That's just to provide additional information for DCO accounting to review and approve the grant agreements.
Chuck, I thought of something else that I probably need to be talked about. On the Section A, the ICI tab, indirect costs, where you indicate that, that is not locked anymore with the latest version. We realize that you cannot check the box. That's the way it was created from accounting. You have to put an X in there, and it will show up underneath the box. So, Chuck, if you could type in an X in that cell that you're in right now, and then there. Yeah, that's the way it's going to have to look. So, just so you know that. And then also, if you go down further, scroll down further, Chuck, if notice that you have to finish completing that part there. So if you select or if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate, you need to complete that section down there at the bottom as well. And fill it in like Chuck's done right there. Now that's just the way, it's not pretty, but that's the way it needs to be completed. That's the way accounting has set it up. Also on the FAFATA tab, that is for, so if it's not applicable, At the top of it has been unlocked, so if it's not applicable, then type in after that first part there that it's not applicable, and that way we'll know that you've seen it and that it's not applicable. So, yeah, just like you're doing there. That's perfect. That's perfect. And then you don't have to complete the rest of it. So I just wanted to point that out because I had a couple of questions on that recently.
Okay. Do we put in zero? There's another question. Do we put in zero if we do not have an indirect cost rate or not fill it out? Yeah, you can just put in zero in the indirect cost rate in the field at the indirect cost worksheet. You enter your costs manually in column F. You don't have to enter anything in column G because you don't have a direct cost base. And then just enter zero up at the top. Yeah, the whole purpose, if you're not charging indirect costs, the whole purpose of that indirect worksheet will be to provide detail about the sub roll-up line items or the roll-up line items. And so if you enter zero, then you should see zeros in the fields at the bottom above the comment field. Okay, I think that covers all the questions, so that does it for the uniform budget template walkthrough. I believe this is being recorded, and it should be available on Illinois WorkNet at a later date.